Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. My name is Mohammad Abu Shoid Abdullah and I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of English, East West University, Bangladesh. The title of my presentation is Englishness and Childhood, Lewis Carroll's Politics of Language in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll presents and represents Wonderland as a foil to Victorian society in his text Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in terms of rationalism, gender roles, class, education, rationality, and power and identity. In Victorian society, Englishness parades as a standard decorum and nobility, yet beneath this polished surface lie tensions of exclusion, rigidity, and imperial authority. Carroll's Wonderland, by contrast, becomes a space where rules fail, meaning collapses, and the child's voice emerges not as ignorant or unformed, but as politically and socially subversive. Therefore, Caroll uses language to destabilize the adult-defined identity of the child and reveals that both nationhood and childhood are constructed and regulated through language in this text. Thus, Lewis Carroll highlights language as not only a tool to show childhood innocence, identity, and madness in a wonderland, a redefined Englishness and a complementary world. However, in a way, Caroll rewrites Englishness through depicting Alice, a convenient Victorian child's journey in a parallel world by using his politics of language, techniques, and characters to challenge Victorian values and power dynamics, to highlight English pride such as English language, literature, and folklore, and to critique rigid laws in English society. There is a vital interplay between the politics of literature and the politics of language. In this text, Caroll uses literature to give the reader a piece of entertainment and through that highlights English society. Moreover, language serves as a privileged site where his dynamics becomes most apparent in his text. In a way, his politics of language expose the flaws of the Englishness that was practiced in Victorian society and corrected all this in a new form of Englishness in Wonderland through the words. However, the author's politics does not necessarily have to link with the politics. It refers to how artistic practices either disrupt or uphold existing social structures by reshaping the ways individuals experience and interpret the world through the way they perceive their world. In this way, literature is self-referential and autonomous. It makes things visible through writing. In the text, Alice might be described as falling into language. The word only means something while we recognize it as such. Beyond that recognition, the thing itself is absent. Moreover, as Schatz said, I quote, "The absurdity of Alice's fixation with facts and lessons is more of a critique of the system that produced this behavior than it is a commentary on the child character itself." Unquote. Therefore, by portraying a child character, her choice of words, and her encounter with nonsensical characters and activists, Caroll draws a point of view towards Englishness. Caroll uses different language as a complementary elements to the language, different techniques. He employs a unique structure that highlights various narrative viewpoints in the form of a dialogue. In the first place, Alice talks to herself. At other places, she has dialogues with other characters. Again, the narratives also shift between third-person narrative and the author's direct commentary. I quote, "Since Alice is in the habit of talking to herself, there can be a good deal of monologue." Unquote. Moreover, she talks with other creatures in the wonderland, which she often finds nonsensical. As Missick says, I quote, "Alice is the initiator of conversation. First, she creates the thought about conversation, and then the conversation goes on. But not for long. She interrupts it when she realizes that it is illogical and boring. She thinks up new words to confirm the situation or to make it better. Or she talks only for the sake of conversation in order to realize how many silly statements there are in the conversation itself." I quote. Thus, in a way, Alice's interruptions and creation of new words demonstrate her active engagement with language. Besides, in terms of the direct comments, Caroll uses the first bracket. For instance, in the first place, when Alice talks about latitude or longitude, the author immediately explains, in the bracket by the way, Alice had not the slightest idea what latitude was or longitude either, but she thought they were nice grand words to say. Both quotation and the bracket ends here. In a way, the author keeps reminding his reader that they are dealing with a child, and a child will not have much idea about geography. However, in a way, he tries to prove that she is an English child, and English people are superior in many ways, even in geography. The author explains Alice's words and actions, which give insight into her thoughts and the bigger themes of the story, while contrasting Victorian Englishness with a peculiar version of Englishness found in Wonderland. Again, when there are nonsensical conversations between Alice and other characters, the author's direct conversation is silent. In a way, the author gives the reader a chance to laugh while reading. In this text, Wonderland is used as a foil to Victorian society, which was rigid and strong on morality and family values. However, everything was pretension. This text highlights both social behavior and the child's mind. At its core, Englishness evokes a cultural ideal rooted in discipline, civility, and an elevated moral code. Again, there is a sense of superiority in their values. In the very first place, Alice behaves as a pure English child. She chooses big words just because they sound good. Moreover, she talks about mathematics, geography, history, and language with such pride. She was initially a colonizer who tried to practice her rigid Englishness, which she had learned. Ultimately, Caroll portrays Wonderland as a more imaginative alternative to the rigid cultural and linguistic structures of English society, the Victorian English society. By using language, Alice not only resists but also reframes the meaning imposed on her and holds a reformed Englishness. In her journey, language becomes a means of empowerment rather than more subjugation. Victorian girls are expected to be polite, obedient, and prepared for domestic roles. She is expected to memorize these roles. Mokbel says, I quote, Alice is very concerned about having good manners and is always trying to remember the lessons she has at school. All these things are expected of a of a 7-year-old Victorian girl. Her opinions and arguments are products of typical Victorian childhood education. Unquote. However, Alice has a questioning tendency. She questions everything and she even questions her own existence. I quote, but if I am not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? Ah, that's a great puzzle. Unquote. Here she breaks all the traditional norms of Victorian society. According to Sarah Barmazo Romero, I quote, Queen Victoria constantly reiterated her own opposition to women's rights and her firm belief that her sex belonged to its own separate domestic sphere. Unquote. However, Caroll revises these rigid gender roles in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland questions, challenges, and often gets frustrated with the absurdities of Wonderland. In a way, she expresses independence and curiosity. Caroll represents Alice as an advanced woman in English society. Moreover, this tendency to question also extends to religion and its associated practices in that era, thereby allowing Caroll to engage with religious themes in a subtle and indirect manner. Moreover, Caroll also reiterates class distinction in the text. For example, the Duchess's maid, who was part of the working class and a woman, was therefore doubly subjugated in Victorian society. However, in Wonderland, by giving her a voice, Caroll revises the gender and class roles in this parallel world. One of the proudest things for English people is their language. According to them, the language is the best of all. However, in this text, Caroll shows the universality of language, that there needs to be a different language in different places to communicate with different people. He therefore rejects the idea of hierarchy. For example, when Alice talks with the mouse, she thinks that, I quote, perhaps it doesn't understand English. I dare say it's a French mouse come over with William the Conqueror, unquote. She also tries to recall his brother's Latin grammar. Again, the creatures use music while communicating with Alice when they lose their words. This reflects the Bakhtin idea of heteroglossia, and that they express different expressions with the same words to have a fruitful conversation. Thus, Caroll highlights that language has no hierarchy. Rachel Cameron analyzes the intricate dynamic between the child's gaze and adult's interpretive lens. I quote, Alice, Caroll's dream child, ostensibly represents a resistant subject, an inversion of the commonplace that Victorian children should be seen and not heard. The Victorian context considered children's bodies, like children themselves, to be innocent. So it is more not surprising that Alice is represented textually as a plasticine girl. Throughout the narrative, her corporeality is pushed, pulled, and stretched, squashed, and modified. Unquote. Alice enters the Wonderland as a rigid colonizer. However, through her journey, she becomes a symbol of reimagined Englishness, where she embraces curiosity, imagination, and questions the established norms. Through her journey, traditional Victorian values are playfully subverted, which offers a vision for a more fluid and open cultural identity. In this way, Alice as a child redefines what it means to be English in a rapidly changing world. So to conclude, the interplay of imaginative freedom and the rejection of rigid hierarchy offers a vision of an alternative society. In a way, it is more democratic and liberating than Victorian society. In Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll offers more than a whimsical tale. He subverts traditional notions of Englishness through the use of language. Through the depiction of Wonderland, Caroll questions the superiority associated with traditional Englishness, and in a way, he suggests that true English identity lies not in control or conformity, but in adaptability, freedom to question, and celebrating literature. However, by employing nonsensical dialogues and competing voices, Caroll invites the readers to find meaning in their own way. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.